Well, dear Anonymous, thank you for asking that question. And the reason I say that is one of the things I have to be honest with you about. I can't stand when people say that's a good question when it isn't, and because I can't stand it, when I actually take the time to say it is a good question, is because I really, really, really am happy that you asked that. The question you asked is connected to a point I kept repeating, which is we have to remember that these are human institutions. And because they're human institutions, they require human actions to change them. And you're absolutely correct. One of the things about educational environments is they're environments that depend a lot on language. And the language we use can become sedimented, ossified, or closed. And a lot of the reasons we have this colonial language is precisely because a lot of the transformations of the universities came alongside the growth of colonialism. The first university, the non-indigenous community of learning, because there were communities of learning in Abayala, which is the indigenous name for Central America. When we think about the fact that a group of priests came to what's today the Dominican Republic and built a university there, the reason the priests were involved was because the priests were literate. And a lot of the expansion of colonialism needed civil servants. They needed people who could give the proper accounting, the proper chronicles, the proper legal structures to the administering of colonial practices. And that's exactly why there's first, second class, and all of that stuff. Now, you could see how different systems developed their approach to colonial administration. For instance, in the British system, to teach, one just had to have a master's to be in the university. They weren't a PhD system. In the French system, they had the aggregate system. They had all kinds of stuff that's linked of the French Empire. The German system had its own, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's up to us, and the US had its own because the US wanted to create a hybrid of the British system and the German system, but they wanted it to be geared for the services of industry, business, and profits. So you could see how that works its way out. But if we're going to create an alternative model, you're absolutely correct. We need to change the language. I notice a big difference, for instance, when I start my classes with a conversation with my students on why study this subject? What is it about? Because if they reflect about why they're studying it and they are able to answer it, they know when they come to class each week why they're there. But I also have a conversation of what a professor and what a student is. And many students do think professors are like Moses with the tablets or somebody coming from up high. But I explain at least my understanding of what a professor is someone who fell in love with learning and continued to learn. And because I argue that we should have the classroom as a learning environment, a co-learning environment, that develops a different relationship to the practice. So if we were to expand this, if we think about the way universities are currently organized, the fact of the matter is certain ways of presenting the arrangement of how to communicate in a room, in a space, that may be detrimental for certain populations, including those who have historically been in those spaces, that could be detrimental to them. And the reason it could be detrimental to them is because the world moves on. And what was designed, why are we maintaining practices, even the physical organization of classrooms that was designed for a period that was fundamentally a group of conquistadors or white male soldiers who were being prepared to go out there and completely and dominate a group of people and extract wealth from them. If we're going to say that is wrong, we're going to have to arrange things differently. And I'll give you an example. When I was in New York in the 80s, I created a school. And the school, I didn't plan to create a school originally. What happened was the principal of a school came to me when I was uh, uh, teaching there, and I was teaching social studies there. And he noticed that my attendance rate, my students, it was just very high. But then it became something also very unusual. There were students cutting classes to go into my classes. Now, you have to imagine this. If high school kids are cutting classes, secondary school kids, it's usually because they're going to go hang out, party, smoke, whatever it may be. But to cut a class to go to a class, that's a very unusual situation. So the principal said that there's a whole category of students who are outside of the system. There's students nobody wants to teach, and maybe I could use whatever I was doing in the classroom with them. And what ended up happening was the creation of a thing called the Second Chance Program. Now, here's the thing about the Second Chance Program to bear in mind. The way my colleagues and I approached it was to make every step of that program participatory. So we started off the program in a blank room. Nothing was in the room, just empty room. And we had a 1 week conversation with all the students. There were 75 of them. All of them, we had a conversation, what's the school? What's the school about? And it's amazing what young people just had to say, what they were thinking about. At first, they had very negative attitudes. But when I explained to them that schools were actually from the concept of leisure time, it was supposed to be the place in which you are able to realize and make grow your humanity. They were surprised. And eventually it led to a point where one of them said, well, how is our humanity going to grow in an empty classroom? There are no chairs, there's nothing in there. So we began to have a conversation of, well, what kind of furniture should we have in there? And at this moment, they began to realize something. Why is it that we have these uncomfortable chairs, this whole structure designed for passive learning? What if we went to Goodwill, got comfortable chairs, different plants, different ways, and because they were all active, there was one person who did murals. He was a graffiti artist, so we did a mural. We changed the walls into a mural. Every student contributed to the learning environment. And what happened was they began to succeed. In fact, a lot of these students began to realize that their education was in their hands. And they began to realize how much they could learn from each other, and the language began to change. And what's interesting, this was a multiracial classroom. There were female students, male students, there were all kinds, and there were people from all walks of life. But the main thing that happened was this important issue, and this is what comes back to somebody like Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon in A Dying Colonialism, it's actually was year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, but also in Le Damné de la Terre, The Damned of the Earth. Fanon noticed something very important, and that's what I observed with those students, and that's what I've observed in education throughout my career, which is people just learn more, they're able to understand more, they're able to grow if they're actively involved in their learning. So what Fanon basically argued is that it's important to become actional. And if we're talking about actionality, then the fundamental thing that needs to be done is to begin to develop concepts that can actually facilitate growth, empowerment, and learning, rather than concepts that are designed to diminish people. I wasn't kidding when I said I don't believe in grading. It's part of an expectation that I'm supposed to grade. But what I do is I have a conversation with my students on grading. There's nothing I do when I teach that we don't converse about and ask why. And if we say, okay, this system wants us to grade, then let's have a conversation on what's a way to structure things in which the learning, the education, supervenes over the question of narrow models of assessment. Because it's more important to me that any educational encounter is one in which the students are able to go out into the world and they continue to be students in the sense that they have now learned how to learn. In other words, they have their independence. So if we are going to do that, we do need new concepts, and we need to rethink not only the words, but we also need to rethink the architecture of educational institutions. And that's a longer conversation, but Fanon also talked about that. You can see right away if a piece of architecture is designed to intimidate you rather than to welcome you.